Okay, guys, good evening. Welcome to this week 3 meeting of the Asian Metropolis. I just want to remind you what we're doing at the moment. So, first week we had just an introduction where we were chatting a little bit and then just explaining the structure of the course, right? Then last week I started to talk about theories. Now, this second meeting is part of 4 meetings from week 2 to 5, in which we try to develop a framework to think about urban policies, but also about what is called policy transfer. And we try to develop a framework that you can use to think about how should you do this, how should you learn from another place. Now, last week we discussed that under neoliberalism, and there can be many different forms of neoliberalism, that city leaders perceive that their cities are in competition. So the general situation of urban management under neoliberalism is competition. Competition for what? Well, competition between cities to win work, to win money, to get GDP, to get well-educated people, to do better in the world, right? So, according to leaders, urban leaders under neoliberalism, their job is conceived as winning that competition. And how do they do that? Well, they compare themselves with other cities and they try to see what other cities do. I mean, imagine that you have a company yourself. If you see that your competitor is producing goods that are much cheaper than yours, you're going to start to think like, how is this possible, right? And then you're going to think, and maybe what you do is you find a spy, or you hire somebody from that company and you let them explain how do they work. And then you find that they've got some new invention to reorganize the business process. And because of that, their product can be cheaper, right? And you want to learn from that and you want to implement that yourself. Urban leaders function the same way. They go around the world to look for policies that work well, and then they want to copy those in their own city. So that's called policy transfer. Now, last week we were talking about the neoliberalism as setting. Today we're going to talk about policy transfer as a process. And then next week and the week after we will be talking about how can that be successful and how could you judge if it is successful, right? So how are we going to do that? What are today's contents? Well, as you might remember, last week I didn't manage to finish all the slides. It was quite sudden at the end, and it was 8:30, and I said, okay, it's time, we need to go, right? And we didn't discuss one of the texts that you've been reading. So what we'll start with is just go back at the start, not too long, because we need time for today as well, of course, but we'll go back to what we were talking about last week, the Entrepreneurial City, and especially we will look at the text that we didn't discuss last week, because as I've explained to you, a big part of these meetings are discussing text, so that it can help you for the test, right? So we'll start with that. After that, the actual contents of today's meeting will start. We will first talk about developmentalism. So this is developmentalism is a certain belief. It can be wrong. A lot of people believe it's wrong, but this is a belief that has been guiding a lot of thinking about cities for a long time. And this belief is that all cities go through the same processes, and that this development is sort of one stage follows the other one, and over time, because of that, cities will develop. So development actually is better. If you're more developed, you get better as a city. So it's got a very linear idea of history in cities. We first discussed that ideology. Next, we're going to talk specifically about the transfer of policies, and we'll use the text by McCann and Ward that you've read for this week. After this, we will talk about, if you talk about transfer, it's always transferred from somewhere to somewhere else, right? So we're going to talk about this direction. And for a long time, people have been thinking that transfer means coming from the West, going through elsewhere. We're going to look at an author that says that that's not true. So the second text we're going to look at today, by Aiwa Ohm, is very strongly stressing that transfer is not only from the West to the rest of the world, but that transfer actually goes from anywhere to anywhere. And that there's a lot of transfer and assumptions as if it's always coming from the West. They are ideological and they're not right. And it's important to break those down, because otherwise people keep copying everything in the West, which very often is not so good for a place. Then fourth, we will say something about what is called homogenization, or the process that everything becomes the same. So with transfer, of course, things from around the world are being moved to other places, right? And because of this, it seems that cities become similar. So you've got Starbucks everywhere, you've got McDonald's everywhere, you've got all these European brands everywhere, and increasingly you can also Chinese brands that go all over the world. So it seems if you go through a shopping mall, for instance, or a shopping street, it's sometimes even hard to know in which place you are. So it seems that every city becomes the same. We're going to look a little bit at that argument that everything becomes the same. And then in the end, we'll have some conclusions. Okay, so let's go back to last week first. Now, I told you already last week, and I reminded you last week we were talking about neoliberalism, right? And we looked at this text, a journal article from The Guardian, from Metcalfe, which is quite a historical description of neoliberalism. And then after that, we discussed this text, a quite complex text by David Harvey, right? And the core argument of David Harvey was that under neoliberalism, city governments have become entrepreneurial. City government, in the struggle with other cities in their competition, they start to act, let's say, like businesses. They started to act as entrepreneurs, and they especially focus on increasing the GDP in the city. They get really worried about business. So, and we've discussed a couple of forms. According to Harvey, there's 4 forms that this strategy can take, and then we talked a little bit about the downsides of that, right? Now, I want to say a couple of things more about those downsides, because I went really quick last week about this. So, first of all, one of the very clear outcomes of this focus of cities on GDP growth is that now around the world, cities are building sites. There is real estate development everywhere. Now, it doesn't matter if you come from Hong Kong or if you come from mainland China, you're very aware of the fact that building really transforms cities, right? So these images of cranes is a pretty normal thing. And obviously that didn't only happen in China, but also very strongly in Dubai. So in the mid-1990s, there was a calculation that about 80% of all the cranes in the world were either in China or in Dubai, because there was so much building going on in these 2 places alone, right? But it's not only those places. There is examples of cranes in Seattle, there's cranes in Vietnam where they're building infrastructure. This is happening inside cities and outside cities. The experience that we have nowadays is development and real estate development, right? And that's part of how city governments now try to push GDPs. Now, one book that's not on the reading list, but that's really interesting about this is this book by Samuel Stein. He's a New York critical journalist, and he writes about the growing influence of real estate on the functioning of cities. So what he says is, taken together, we witness the rise of the real estate state. So this means that increasingly the interest of the decision-making of the state, of governments, both at the national level and in the city level, are being influenced and determined by what real estate developers want, right? So it's a political formation in which real estate capital has inordinate influence over the shape of our cities, the parameters of our politics and the lives we lead. So Stein is saying that increasingly in cities nowadays, if you want to understand urban decision making, you have to look at real estate and the interest of real estate. This is really where the decisions are being made. This is already for a long time very clear in Hong Kong, but also if you look in mainland China and cities, it's very clear that the proximity of big real estate developers to especially district offices is really close, because district offices and also cities need these developers to get their projects done. So what are the downsides of this? Well, we talked about a couple of those last week, right? There were, using Harvey, there were 3 downsides. First of all, Harvey said that downside is that actually, well, this seems maybe good to a city. How can you be against GDP growth, right? But in the end, Harvey says, it just means that you're subsidizing rich people and that you're hurting poor people. Why? Well, these policies, these entrepreneurial policies cost a lot of money. So the government needs to have that money. Where does the government take that money? From their policies to support the poor. especially, and from all the services that they provide to poorer people. So the governments take away money to support precarious groups and fragile groups, and they use that money to invest in things that are good for business, that are good for tourists, all these groups in society that are relatively rich. So that's the first criticism of Harvey. The second criticism of Harvey is that while the governments do that, they actually invest in projects that are pretty risky. Last week, I think we talked about the Tokyo Olympics, and how Tokyo government and also Japanese government has invested a lot of money into these Olympics, and now they couldn't stop those Olympics anymore because the financial risks were too big. But then it didn't bring them so much because these Olympics were a bit of a disaster, obviously, from a point of view of what they wanted to do. They spent a lot of money, and this was not ideal at all. So these are very risky projects. So while it's really bad for poor people and good for rich people, they're also risky, these projects. So they could actually turn out to be really bad for city governments. And then a third problem is that while they're really risky, also they can be easily copied. So these city governments around the world are now having policies that are good for rich people and not so good for poor people, that are risky, but on top of that, they don't really structurally change something because other cities will copy them very quickly. So it's not really kind of fundamentally change something. So overall, it's not surprising that in these cities with entrepreneurial government, the happiness, the satisfaction of citizens is really getting worse and worse and worse with their city governments. So therefore, if you look around the world over the last, say since just after the global financial crisis 2008, 2009, in so many cities around the world, there have been big social movements of protest. It's for instance, in the Middle East, with all the Jasmine revolutions, these started as economic protests. In Spain, in southern Europe, Spain and Greece, there have been enormous protests. And these all centered on cities, on city spaces, but they were all about discontentment, unhappiness of citizens with these government policies. And this is because, then there was the Occupy Wall Street movement, all the occupies around the world. This is a global movement. So that does not, and it also very striking, these protests emerged in many different types of government systems. So clearly there is something fundamentally problematic about this entrepreneurial mode of governance, because it just results in a lot of dissatisfaction from citizens, right? So that's what the text that we still need to talk about from last week, that text is about. So this is a text by Margaret Meyer, and it's called Whose City? So first of all, did anybody find out who is Margaret Meyer? Did anybody look that up? So for all you know, it could be Donald Duck or... So Margaret Meyer, first of all, is a woman, and she's a German woman. And she has been doing a lot of research into social movements and oppositional social movements. She's researching situations in which people in cities, especially looking in cities, get really outraged about what governments do, and then she looks at how they organize themselves. So she's doing research in many cities around the world, right? And secondly, Margaret Meyer has a Marxist background. So she feels that capital and the role of global capital plays an enormously important role in the situation of citizens around the world. And she feels that if you want to do something about these problems of these groups, you also have to do something about the problems of capitalism. So basically, Margaret Meyer believes that either you should end capitalism, or at least you should control it much more as a state. So that's her background. Now, in this paper, the title is Whose City? From Ray Powell's Critique of the Keynesian City to Contestations Around Neoliberal Urbanism. Right? That's the title. Does anybody know who is Ray Powell? So Ray Powell is a very well-known English urban sociologist who did research in the 1970s. He's an old guy. He passed away now, right? And what he especially, and the 1970s UK, he was from England, he was studying how opposition and critique, citizen critique of the government in the 1970s, how that functioned. Now the 1970s in the UK was the heydays of the welfare state, right? So there was a lot of social housing, there was a lot of government support for poor people, all these sort of things. So Ray Powell is looking at how people felt under welfare state, under the welfare state. So that's what this paper starts with. Now, if you read it, you will find that the sort of criticism, so you would maybe expect, like in a welfare state, a lot of people are happy, right? Or at least poor people are better supported than if there's no welfare state. So for instance, if you would compare the USA in the 1970s with the EU countries, then actually the social standards in the EU countries were much better than in the USA. Poverty was much lower, all these sort of, if you would just judge cities according to these things, the UK looked much better than the USA, right? However, Ray Powell shows that that doesn't mean that people weren't happy. And the unhappiness especially focused on the decisions that the urban managers were making in the welfare state. So if you have a welfare state, somebody needs to decide on if you get a public housing or not, right? There's always a decision maker. Well, the decision making about these things, people were unhappy with. It's very similar to, if you would go back to the 1970s, 1960s, 70s in Chinese cities. At that time, most people were living in what in English are called work units. I think they're called danwei in Chinese. These units, they are housing units owned by the state-owned enterprises, right? Now the houses that the workers lived in those units were given to them by the decision makers within the state-owned enterprise they worked for. There were quite a lot of, and there was quite a lot of discussion about who got which house and under which rules. So that's the same thing that you could see in 1970s UK. So the paper first shows that also the welfare state in England, that there was still a lot of discontentment of citizens with government decision making, right? Next, what this paper does is it looks at the transformation from the welfare state city to the neoliberal city. And it discusses the characteristics of that transformation, and it focuses on 4 points. These 4 points are on pages, which pages are they? 173 to 175. So what are these 4 characteristics, according to Margaret Meyer, of the neoliberal city? What is the first characteristic that she mentions?
City officials do whatever they can do to ensure the growth.
Yeah. So the first characteristic of urban management in the neoliberal city is that city officials will focus first and foremost on growth. And growth is here defined as economic growth, right? So while city governments will know that, for instance, environmental pollution might be a problem, but they're only interested in environmental pollution if it hurts economic growth. They're just interested in economic growth. That's the standard that they will look at. Well, there's been a lot of attention also in mainland Chinese cities at how mayors, for instance, make decisions. And it's pretty clear that for mayors to make promotion, it's important that they do well on a lot of parameters. And one of the main parameters also in mainland China is you need to show that you have done well economically. So this sort of focus on GDP, that was the same in cities in Europe, in the United States. This is the thing, if you look at what mayors try to do, the first thing generally is try to generate economic growth. Now that's also not totally ununderstandable, because if your economy is not good, you have a lot of unemployment. If you have a lot of unemployment, your social problems get much bigger, right? So it's important to have economic growth, or at least to have a healthy economy. It's not strange, right? The only I think what's striking about what Margaret Meyer is saying, she's not saying, well, they're looking at growth. They're saying first and foremost, it's really strongly focused on growth, even in situations where that might not be so good. So what is the second characteristic of urban management under the neoliberal city?
Is the adoption of the entrepreneurial forms of government.
Yeah. So she echoes what David Harvey wrote in the previous paper that we discussed last week, that city governments operate entrepreneurially. So they go out into the world and they try to achieve growth. And we've discussed a couple of ways in which they can do that, right? Give tax incentives to companies, give free land to companies, even offer them money. Build good roads so that companies are happy to come there. It's an entrepreneurial approach to attract business to your city. There's two more points that Margaret Meyer makes. What's the third point, according to Margaret Meyer, of urban management under neoliberalism?
Intensify privatization.
Yeah. What does that mean?
It means that the public infrastructures and the public service is being private.
Can you give some examples of what was privatized?
I think might be, for example, like the subway can be managed by the private company.
Yeah, it's a good example. So train companies. So British Rail is a private company now. British Rail used to be a state-funded, state-owned company, right? Think about airlines. Like every country has their national airline. Air France, KLM is the Dutch airline, Lufthansa the German airline. In China, there's all these airlines like these. All used to be state airlines. They are now almost all private companies. Now think about other things. In mainland China, before the reforms of the especially the late 1980s, the early 1990s, generally, I said before, people were living in houses that they were not owning. There was no private ownership of houses. You were basically living in houses that were owned by your state-owned enterprise, right? What has happened then is that a lot of those houses have been sold to the people living in those houses. So a lot of housing used to be public housing. In a lot of countries, public housing has been sold. So these are houses that were built by the government, they were for a long time managed by the government, and they were rented out to poor people. And at some point, the government just sold those houses to people, not for a market price maybe, but they made them private houses. It's another example. Now you can go on endlessly. Telephone definitely used to be state monopolies. Right now, around the world, telephone companies are private companies, and they're global companies, and they're really big, right? So increasingly, all these companies, all these services that used to be provided by the state, and thereby also could be sort of distributed in a way that was fair, are now just provided by the market. Now, this is for states with a lot of why is this good for a state? Why would a state want to do this?
I think it might be more efficient.
Yeah, so the argument that it's more efficient is a typical neoliberal argument. Because the market works best, right? And any interference with the market is inefficient. So, and it's also true in certain aspects, in certain fields. What else can be a good reason to do this? So what's another reason to privatize public goods? So one reason, think about telephone industry, for instance. When the telephone industry was a state-owned industry, there was not a lot of innovation. Even the telephones themselves were being produced by the state, right? Do you think that the state would have produced an iPhone or a new technology? If you look at the type of services nowadays that's being provided when you have in your telephone services, it's outrageous. These are all innovations. Well, traditionally, government bureaucracies are not very good at innovating. They're very good at delivering things for a standard cost. They're not good at renewing things. They're very storagey, right? So there's not a lot of innovation if it's driven by the government. Now there's a third reason relating to money. Why would privatization be, what sort of effects does privatization have on the economy, on money? So imagine that you own 10 apartments, right? And then you sell them. What happens with your money? What happens?
I have more cash.
Yeah.
And as a government, have more money to do other investments.
Yeah. So it gives cash to the government that they then can use for things that they want to do, like investing in these expensive entrepreneurial programs, right? Another advantage is if you put these houses on the market, then private capital can invest in them, because at once it becomes a private property, right? So it's really good for rich people who want to invest their money into the into the real estate market. So and on top of that, it basically grows your GDP, because if you sell a house, that's income that you can put on your bank statement, on your statement. So basically, a lot of governments have been just increasing their GDP in the city by just privatizing things, because then at once the market grows, which is of course totally artificial. Now for the same thing, so think for instance about embassies around the world or consular buildings. If you look here in Hong Kong on the Peak, a lot of the buildings on the Peak, these really old villas, are being owned by different countries around the world as the houses of their consular services, as their embassies and so on. These buildings are worth enormous much money. What governments increasingly are doing is just selling those off. So they get one big chunk of money now. Of course, long term, that's not a very smart idea, because in 100 years, those houses will be worth much more. So from a strategic point of view, it's a very bad policy, because in 100 years, they still need property to be here. But it's very short-term thinking. It's just about making money now, right? So that's the third argument, according to Margaret Meyer, that's happening in cities. What is the last argument, the fourth argument?
Is is to take some measures to deal with the social polarization.
Yeah, but she's not so much saying that that governments take measures. She says that the governments change their measures regarding poor people or precarious people. And basically when she says they change it, she means earlier there was much more money to take care of poor people, and now these programs have become much smaller. So there are still some programs so that the state can say, you see, we do something for poor people. So for instance, there is still social housing building by city governments, and then they've got a couple of houses, it's never going to fix the problem. And then they can say, you see, we do something for poor people. They're very small projects generally. You see this in cities around the world. So instead of having structural solutions for structural problems, they now only want to do sort of statements that look good, but that don't really help to fix the problem. So it's a very cynical view that Margaret Meyer has on how city governments are operating. It's not very positive. She's very critical of urban management under neoliberalism. Now, the next thing that Margaret Meyer does, and this is also quite interesting, then she describes in the last part of her paper how these policies in turn result in growing dissatisfaction by groups in society about government policy. And she's saying that these groups in society are quite diverse. So if you look at page 178, at the top she says, well, there's activist networks. And funny enough, these activist networks, they consist partly of radical groups that are just anti-government anyway, but they also consist of middle-class urbanites. So for instance, we discussed this last week, we're all worried about not being able to buy a house, right? Even if you're middle class, it doesn't mean that your life is easy, right? So increasingly in cities, middle class people, they get angry about how their situation in the city is. So they are also willing to protest, actually. And then there are, of course, groups that are in precarious situations, whose lives is really difficult. There's also artists involved in these things. And then also environmental groups very often are part of these sort of programs. But what Margaret Meyer says is that while the policies are more and more focused on policies that are good for rich people, well, it's not so good for poor people, increasingly these poor and also middle class groups start to be dissatisfied and they start to protest. And these protests, of course, in different cities very often focus on different things, but they are all about the same thing very often. So Margaret Meyer says, if you see all these local protests, groups around the world should realize that they're all protesting basically the same thing. And they should focus on that thing, which is that neoliberal economy and entrepreneurial governance within that neoliberal economy increases inequalities more and more and more and more, up to the point that too many people cannot have a decent life anymore. So that's a very cynical view, a very critical view of the consequences of entrepreneurial governance, right? Okay, so in conclusion, these are the arguments of Margaret Meyer. There has been a move from a Keynesian to a neoliberal city, and when she's discussing the Keynesian city, she especially uses the arguments of Ray Powell about urban managers. When she discusses the neoliberal city, she says there's 4 dimensions to the neoliberal city, and then she discusses the growth of social movements in opposition to these developments, right? So in a test, you should be able to reproduce those things. Explain what is the Keynesian city and what sort of discontent was there, what is the neoliberal city and what are the characteristics, the 4 characteristics of the neoliberal city, and then why is there growing discontent in the neoliberal city, right? Does anybody have questions about this? So this is where we should have ended last week, and I was too slow. Okay, that brings us to the topic for today, policy transfer, and especially the question that we start to ask is, do policies work everywhere? Because when you do policy transfer, of course, you're assuming that it will be good, right? So the first question then probably is, what is policy transfer? Now you've read the paper by McKenna Ward, which is quite explicit about this. So what do you think is typical for policy transfer? Anybody, what's policy transfer?
I think it's a way to learn the other cities' advanced experience.
Yeah, so a part of policy transfer is look at other cities and learn about their experiences. What else is an element of policy transfer?
Policy transfer must be successful in developing a system.
Yeah.
And be both considered by agents or individuals and through the process with parents.
Yeah. So you're saying two things. First of all, you're going to look at the policy that is successful, which probably also means that you have a standard for success, because you need to be able to say this one is successful and that one is not successful, right? And then you pick the one that's successful and you want to bring that to somewhere else. And what you're saying in addition to this, that specific agents are important in that process of bringing it from one place to another. Now, that comes from the paper of McKenna and Ward, right? So we'll talk about that in a little bit. I think you also wanted to say something in the back.
Policy transfer, which study how policies are learned from one context and moved to another with the hope of a similar result.
Yeah. Yeah, so what you're adding in this sentence is very important. The assumption of policy transfer is that you first go look somewhere else, you see what they do, you see what works, and then you assume that if I do that as well here, it will have the same results, right? So that's a very important element of policy transfer, the assumption that something that works somewhere can also work somewhere else. And that's exactly the assumption that we will be talking about, that's only partly true. Any other remarks regarding policy transfer?
You need to fuse the policy depends on your city's own situations.
Yeah. So that's a very important point. You need to, when the policy is moved, it needs to, what you can say, land in the place where you are. So just like a plane is landing somewhere, right? A policy also needs to land, and it means the situation where you are needs to be receptive for that policy. And some things in the place where you are probably need to be adjusted, but partly also the policy will be adjusted. So there is a process of adjustment of the place where the policy goes to the policy, and they are mutually adjusted. Sometimes the policy is changed because it doesn't work there. Sometimes the regulations in the place where it goes are changed, right? There's all these adjustments. So for instance, just to give an example, the special economic zone policy that was invented here in China, just over the border, was the first special economic zone, right? That has been now spread around the whole world, because it was so successful in attracting international business, right? A lot of elements of this policy had to do with adjustments to labor laws, for instance, adjustment to taxation laws. In some other countries where this policy was brought, the governments were not willing to make those changes. For instance, in India, the labor organizations were really strong. And for a long time, governments implemented the special economic zone policy where the labor regulations were not changed, and then international business was not so interested in going there, right? you can only understand that because of the characteristics of the place where the policy went. So the characteristics of why you bring the policy are really important to understand the success of policy transfer. It's a little bit, I always think that the example of food is really good in this. So if you're, we talked about Chinese cuisine before, I think, right? There's Chinese restaurants around the world, right? If you, and of course, one way of thinking about food is to think that where it comes from, that's the original food. So that's how it's supposed to be. So if you want to know what is Cantonese food, you have to look in Guangdong or in Hong Kong, one of the two, or at least the South area. If you want to know Szechuan food, the real authentic Szechuan food, of course, will be in Szechuan, right? So, and then but then if you see that when these chefs from these countries, when they go to other countries, if they cook their original food, they will find out that actually very often their clients, the customers, will not like it, right? So if you go eat Chinese food in the Netherlands, for instance, Szechuan food, it's just really, really not nice because it's not spicy, because Dutch people don't like spicy food. Even here in Hong Kong, the Szechuan food is not as spicy as it is back in Szechuan, because in Cantonese cuisine, a lot of Hong Kong people don't like spicy food so much, right? So you will adjust. So this is an example of transfer. It's not a policy, but it's food transfer. But in the process of food transfer, either the customers will have to change their behavior, or the chef will have to change his cooking, because it needs to be appreciated by the people, right? And very often it will happen both. People start to appreciate the food a little bit, but then also the chefs change their food. So if you want to eat Thai food outside of Thailand, it's just really bad or really boring for Thai people, because Thai food is so spicy that nowhere else in the world people will like it almost. So you get these, so it's the same example as with policies. It's the same type of process. Things need to still be working at the place where they're brought. Okay, so we're going to talk about this process. I showed you these contents already, right? So we're going to talk about developmentalism first. And why do we talk about developmentalism? Well, the idea of developmentalism is that there is one set of developments, and there's some place that is most developed. And everybody has to go to the place to be most developed. So you should learn from the places that developed first. That's where you need to learn. So policy transfer goes from the developed place to the undeveloped place. It's a very multi-directional way of thinking. And we will criticize, or we will discuss that point. And then after that, we will talk about the text by McKenna and Ward, and then Iowa Om. So developmentalism first. This is hard to read. What? It's beautiful. So I've written down developmentalism. It's an old world logic. This is typically how in the 1950s and 60s and 40s people were thinking in the Western world. They were most developed, and they felt like everybody needs to be developed, so everybody has to go through this. And what is the idea? The assumption is that cities or countries are different because they are at different stages of the same development process. So you can only imagine, so every city goes from agricultural times to industrial time to post-industrial time. It's all the same sort of process, right? And the differences between cities can only be explained by the moment on this process that you are. So it has to do with, are you more or less developed? Everybody goes through the same development. So secondly, the assumption is that Western cities have developed first, and others will follow. So the Western city is the model for the rest of the world. Now you can, even when I say it, so you already don't directly understand that this is such an ideological, biased view, right? It's a very one-dimensional, as if the West and how the West has done it is the only way to do things. Now, third then, what are best practices in this setting? In this setting, best practices, where are you going to learn? Of course you're going to learn at the developed places. You're going to learn in the West. Because that's where they have the best practices, where they develop most. And then you can learn what they do there, and you bring it to your undeveloped city, to develop the city also, like the Western city. So development, in this sense, becomes Westernization. And this is actually a good process. And the last thing is that in that process, if every city goes through the same process, also every city will become the same in a way. Right? So there are certain markers then that you can see as an indication for success. So for a long time the question was, for instance, is there a McDonald's in this city? Because if there's a McDonald's, the city is more developed. And still in the capital of Laos, Vientiane, there's no McDonald's. So that's still seen as a non-developed city. So it's a very one-dimensional way of thinking. So, and these are some of the books. This is not just, I mean, this is an extremely biased idea. And nowadays, any serious social researcher, any serious politician understands that it's just wrong to think in this way. And it's extremely ideological, and it's actually stupid to think in this way, right? But look at all the books that are about developmentalism. This was a very strong way of thinking in international policy. So the idea is poor countries are poor because they haven't gone through the stages of development that Western countries have gone through yet. They are not yet developed. Every place will be developed if they go through these same sort of steps. And in this view, so also, development will be good. It's good to develop because then you get more advanced and you becoming like a Western city is a good thing. This is also where it's very ideological. So in this way it almost becomes silly in this view to resist becoming like a Western city because you want development, right? Now if you would look in the 1950s, a lot of the international aid work to cities, for instance, consisted of consultants from the West coming to cities outside of the West to write a consultancy report about urban development. So there's, in the 1950s, there's this enormous report by German engineers about the urban development of Bangkok and how they should become a modern city. And basically these German engineers just say they had to demolish the whole city because that was all old and was not important. It needed to develop. It's a very, developmentalism also means breaking down old stuff and replacing it with new stuff. So it doesn't really value what is there. It doesn't value the cultural expressions that are there. It just thinks that these are idiosyncrasies, not really important. So here are then a couple of questions to think about. Will all cities become the same? What do you think of the argument of developmentalism that the differences between cities have to do with different stages on one development path?
I think the answer is no. But according to different geography conditions or cultural customs and other objective conditions that are different to change in a short time, a group of representative cities will develop first and be learned by other cities.
Yeah.
For example, if a city locates in a desert, and it is rich in oil resources, and it also has a Muslim culture, I think the Riyadh, that's the capital of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, will be a representative city. So I argue that the cities will, if the cities have a similar objective conditions, they will develop in a similar way, but will not completely be the same.
So basically what you're saying is, well, cities that have similar situations might develop the same, but then others that have different situations will develop in a different way than those cities. So on the one hand, there are certain trajectories on which cities are, but those are the cities with the same conditions. So there's a couple of different types of trajectories. So for instance, if you would look at Chinese cities, in a way they're all developing relatively similar, but they're developing also partly different from cities in other places. So partly what you're saying is, well, there's something true about this argument, but also something not true. I think. Any other responses to this question? Will cities become the same? Yeah. So what you're saying basically is in the interest of cities economically to also remain a little bit different. So, and you see that in all the branding campaigns of cities, they focus a lot on what they're special about themselves, right? So that's one, yeah, absolutely. Other responses to the question, will cities become the same?
I think my first point is that because of some geographical differences. For instance, in Hong Kong, we have a good harbor so that we can develop some transform or trade from ships. But in some inland city, they cannot do so. And also, my second point is that the culture in different cities are different.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, in the European, especially those North European countries, they are quite likely to accept that the government to establish a higher rate of tax, so that they enjoy the social welfare and social equality. But if you do this in Hong Kong, I do not think people will be happy.
Yeah.
Because in this culture, actually, we have very strong cultural communication among people. So they actually do not want to contribute a lot of their earnings to other people's social welfare.
Sure. So I think culture is a really interesting element to bring into this. My argument would probably be, when you think about these questions, to say, well, certain things in cities will become the same. If you look at the way in which finance works, if you look at the way in which real estate industries work, there are certain things that are traveled around the world and that will influence all cities in the world in a similar way. So part of this argument is actually true, but then the effects that these things have that travel around the world and how they land will be different in places. So even in mainland China, well, these cities might partly look the same. Oh, they actually don't, but even if they look partly the same, still the culture in these cities is actually really different, right? You will really know if you, and even the language is different, the food is different, but also just how people behave in the street is different. So it really also depends a little bit on what do you look at. So if you just look at, are there high rises or are there McDonald's? Yeah, then they're all the same. But if you look at how does it function as a city, what culture is there in that city, how do people behave in this city, what is the effect of this emergence of these new things in a city, that's very different. Some cities have a very strong culture of neighborly help, where a lot of citizens will help each other. Other cities do not have that. So if you introduce new economies in these cities, the effects will be totally different, right? So one way of thinking about it is, well, there might be certain elements, and if you look at them, you see the same thing everywhere. So if every city has a shopping mall now, and they look pretty similar, right? But still, if you look at how it functions, they're very different. Now, another question would be, are cities catching up to others? What do you think of this rhetoric that you need to catch up? Do cities do that? So does anybody have a reaction to that?
I think many Chinese cities, they are catching up with each other. Like those cities who are in tier 2, they always want to compete with each other, and also they want to do better and better and enter the tier 1.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's a very clear example. This rhetoric, this way of thinking, like we need to catch up. So Mumbai wants to be like Shanghai, and then a lot of cities now want to be like Shanghai because it's relatively well organized. It looks modern, like all these sort of things, right? Also within China, you want to be like the most developed or the most successful city, and then very often this is being seen in terms of economy again. So it's actually a little bit in all of us, this thinking about economy first. But then your argument was very good. Like cities also actually need to focus on what they're special about, because otherwise they lose their edge, right? So if you look culturally at cities, actually there is no catching up, because a lot of cities are actually very different from each other. And also in mainland China, cities are culturally really different. And they're also not really, if you look at culture, cities are not really trying to be the same also. Very often with culture, it's really like you embrace that you're different and you like it. So again, here's this difference where on the one hand, this rhetoric of catching up is very common, and we all know that, and we also know that ourselves. And it's also we talked last week about how we all have a neoliberal identity, right? And how we've become all neoliberal citizens. We're also all looking at our classmates. Are they doing well? We want to catch up. We're looking at our brothers and sisters. How are they doing? Or our nephews. You always are thinking about others and comparing yourself. It's very normal and common to do that. Cities also do that, right? So these are two questions before we start to think about policy transfer. I want to suggest before I start with that to do a short break and then continue after the break. Okay? So 10 minutes. No, not the new town, what's it called? New urbanism, yeah. New urbanism was really pushed by architects. It was invented by specific architects, and then there were some gurus within the architecture discipline. The BID was much more pushed by the downtown association, right? So these are different people. In both cases, I have a word and again say that there were a lot of other transfer agents, all sort of parties that help to share the knowledge about this thing, for very often because they make money on it. So think about consultancy firms like McKinsey, right? Very often they are being hired by governments to improve, and the government says, what should we do? Well, these companies very often earn money by sharing that knowledge. So if they have that knowledge, they have an interest. They want to do presentations everywhere, right? So the creative city, for instance, we all know about the creative city, right? It's something we all heard about. This was invented and very strongly pushed by one guy, Richard Florida. He's an American professor. He got a university professor. He got ridiculously rich as a consultant because that policy worked really well, and every city wanted to have advice. And then at some point he could ask like 100,000 euros for like a half-hour talk. It was just ridiculous, right? So there's a lot of money involved in this, in policy transfer. So another question that I have is, I've mentioned this term best practices a lot, and it's being used also in literature a lot. What are best practices? So what is the best practice? Anybody?
Suitable for the local context.
Sorry?
The policy that is suitable for the local context.
So it's a policy that's suitable for a local context, right?
Yeah.
Why is it then a best practice?
Which can mostly effective and active the local economy and other factors.
Yeah. Okay, any other thoughts about best practices? When is something a best practice?
I think best practice will be a best way to achieve development and its success in many places.
Yeah. So how do you judge if it's the best? If the success is best?
GDP grows well.
Yeah, that's of course very often then what the point is, when you talk about a best practice, you need to know what you want to achieve first, right? It's very often it has to do with GDP, but think about how the central government in China very often does all these experiments in different provinces or different cities. The government already before knows what they're going to look at, right? They have a list of criteria. So a best practice is always the best in view of certain criteria. So one of the problems of so what happens if you want to find a best practice? A best practice, you compare a couple of places, you know the criteria, and then you're just going to see what is the outcomes on this one, what's the outcome on this one, and what's the outcome on this one. I said, that's really good. So that's our best practice. So the best practice is always a combination from a certain practice plus a certain judgment about what is good and what's not good. Now the problem is that that judgment very often changes over time. So what is the best practice now, in 5 years it might not be so good. Because then at once there's another criteria. And 5 years later there's another criteria, right? So best practices are always very temporal. Now another question would be, do best practices always work? But I think we've already sort of answered that, so I want to skip that one also because of time. Now, you have to realize that this term best practices is a really neoliberal term. The idea is that there's something the best. It's the term best is absolute, right? Something's the best. So there's really the idea that this works best. So if you look at that from the developmental perspective that we talked about before, then the best practice is the practice that speeds up the development towards the developed stage quickest. The idea, however you do it, is that we can learn from somewhere else. We can go to another place, we can learn there, we can see what works there, and then we pick the one where the outcomes are best according to us. And then, of course, the assumption is what works there will work here as well. And this is why your first argument that it has to do with what is local the best is important. So these were all things that are also in this paper by McKenna Ward that you guys have read. Is this an easy paper or a difficult paper?
Difficult.
Difficult. Do you think there will ever be an easy paper? So did you think, there's two papers today, Our Own and this one. Which one is easier? This
Second
one's
one.
easier. So the Our Own one is really difficult, right? Up to the point where you're reading and you think, like, what's she talking about? Right? So I'll leave more time for this one. But the McKenna and Ward paper, they use a lot of abstract terms that makes it a bit difficult, but luckily they explain quite often what they mean. So you might read a lot of words where you're not sure what it is. Or of course, if you read it in a translation, then maybe it doesn't work so well because it's hard to translate these sort of text. But then overall, they do explain quite well what they do. So what is the core argument of this text, if you would have to summarize it?
I think the main idea is that circulation and mobility and also the time and related to national territorial policy and also clarify this idea with two main policies like the idea and the urbanism.
Yes.
Different ways and different steps.
Okay. I like that a lot what you're saying, but you're using the words territorial and relational. I think we have to get clear what is the meaning of those. So when you say relational and when you say territorial, what do you mean with that?
National means that it can territories that live in policy work in USA and not work in UK, you may need to seek help from the local services or the voters, or you need to rely on the, like the new urbanism, you need to rely on the architecture and resonate with the local family sector.
Yeah. I think that's perfect. So I think food again is a very good way to talk about this. When you're looking at food from a relational point of view, you will look at the travel of food, the fact that food cultures go from one place to the other, and that there's now Chinese chefs around the world, and there's also Thai restaurants around the world, and there's Irish pubs around the world. This is all that has to do with relationality, with moving, right? And a lot of the literature on cities always stresses moving. Also, a lot of the literature on policy looks a lot at policy transfer as something that moves all the time. And what McKenna Ward say is what gets lost very often is still also the importance of the territorial, the fact that things also have to be bound in a place as well. They have to land, right? So what we talked about before, when Chinese food travels, it also needs to be successful on a place if you want to start a restaurant. And then people need to actually come to eat. So you also need to adjust to what's in that place, and you need to get established in that place, right? And that can be really successful. So think, for instance, about, I don't know if I mentioned that before, but did we talk about Indian Chinese food? It's awesome. So if you go to a Chinese restaurant in India, you eat really, really spicy food with a lot of Indian spices. And it's really nice, but it's and you can see how it's inspired by Chinese food, but it's also not really Chinese food because it's sort of Indian food. But then just inspired by but very often these are chefs that were Chinese chefs, and they went to India and they adjust their cooking to the local style, right? So a whole new thing emerges. So you can look at that as something that's Chinese, and then you look at how the origins come from somewhere. You can also look at it at how it's from India and how it has to do with other kitchens in India, right? So whenever you talk about things, you have to think about both how it travels, but also how it lands and how it's bound. And the main argument of McKenna Ward is when you think about policy transfer and successfully learning from other places, you have to do both. On the one hand, you have to make sure that you go look in other places, that you find these policies, that you bring them to a place, and you need to find the best ones, so you need to know how to find them. But on the other hand, they're also saying you need to be very aware of how it's going to land in your setting. You have to understand where you are. You have to understand the characteristics of the rules in your place. Very often it has to do with culture as well. So think about mask-wearing policies. Mask-wearing policies are extremely efficient in many Asian cities. In Europe, it's a drama. This is just cultural. So it's all very nice. So for instance, if European governments want to do policy learning and find best practices regarding COVID responses, and they go to Asian cities and they say, oh, we need to start mask wearing. And obviously we all know that's also true. It's an effective means. But then they go back to Europe and they've done that. And they suggested mask wearing and just nobody's doing it, right? And then you could say, well, then they need to be more stringent. There need to be very heavy penalties if you don't wear it. But that's just culturally not acceptable. So the government doesn't dare doing that. So you can see how a policy that is actually an effective policy, that's even a best practice, but you can't transfer it to another context. Which is, of course, maybe not good. It's from a point of view of controlling COVID, it's very bad. But you have to live with the realities of the place where you want to bring your policy. So as was mentioned before, culture in a place it can be very different, but it's very important for how a policy works out in a certain setting, if it can be successful or not. And that can also be bad. It's not only a good thing, it's also a bad thing partly. So this is the basic point of this paper. It starts with just explaining there's two perspectives, territorial perspective and the relational perspective, right? Next, it's going to talk about transfer. So in the second section, it talks about literatures that exist to theorize the relational and the territorial. That's especially in section 2.1. So there they develop this argument that there's a relational and a territorial, and they look at urban theory, and they discuss authors that have been writing about this. So it's the same point, but then looking at the literature that already exists about this. And then they go in 2.2 on page 177. They start talking about policy transfer. And they say that a lot of the problems with the policy transfer literature is it only looks at sending policies and finding them, but it doesn't look at how policies land. So that perspective is not territorial enough. And then they introduce two case studies, basically. One on the BID, the Business Improvement District, and another one on, I forgot again, New Urbanism. I forget that word every time. And they look at policy transfer. Now let's just look at one of these two case studies because the arguments are the same. So let's look at the Business Improvement District case study. What is a Business Improvement District? The BID. What is this?
CPP program.
Sorry?
CPP program. And is leading by the Global Association. And
One second, what is a PTP program?
Public-private partnership.
Yes, so it's a public-private partnership program. Regarding what? Because there's many types of public-private partnerships. So what is this one about? Yeah, so it's about business districts, right? So think about, in the United States, cities have a central business district. Always in the center is the business. That's, of course, different depending on where you are. And in those business districts, the idea was that the public services regarding cleaning the streets, controlling the streets, all these sort of things that the government needs to do is not good. Businesses are not happy with how the government does that. So what happens is basically that business associations suggest that they do this for the government, and in return they get money from the government. So basically the government outsources part of these tasks, right? And then of course businesses like that, because then they can themselves set the parameters, they can say the criteria. If they find it really important that the street is cleaned every day, it will happen, right? So the business community can adjust the management of this area themselves. They get much more influence. So where was the idea of a business improvement district invented? Start of section 3.1.1. The BID was established in Toronto, the first one, 1970. So that's in Canada, right? In this section, the title is Mobilizing Business Improvement District. What does it mean? Well, the Business Improvement District was invented in Toronto, but then it was transferred to other places. It was mobilized. Who did the mobilizing? How was this done? Yeah. Ames, one second. What is the IDA?
National Downtown Association.
Yeah.
We come from different countries and we apply successfully.
Yeah, so this happened to be sort of a business association of downtown areas around the world that were meeting to discuss together their experiences with problems in business, right? And this association really thought that the business improvement district was a fantastic idea. So what did they start to do? Yeah, so they spent money, that's true, and they shared this knowledge. How did they share this knowledge? Yeah. So partly what they did is just physically get on the plane and go to these other places and say, you need to do this. Partly what they did is they sent this knowledge to think tanks that could spread it. Partly they organized conferences about this. So professors in universities would do research, and this association would actually fund professors to do the research, so that these professors would do the work for them. So there's a whole knowledge infrastructure of all sorts of organizations in universities, in business associations. There were political leaders that were all traveling and moving, and then they were telling all these other cities, you need to do this as well. And then increasingly, cities started to think about this, right? And in America, that was very successful very early on. American cities implemented it directly. Now, this case study does not discuss the implementation, the travel to America, right? It discusses, because it first talks about mobilization, that's what we discussed now, then it's going to talk about territorialization, how it lands. That's in the next section, in section 312 on page 179. There it talks about the landing. In which location does it look? Where is the landing? In the UK, yeah. So they look at a specific case. So they could have looked in many places, of course, because this BID has traveled to many different countries, right? So this is just one case study. What do they observe about the landing of the BID policy in the UK?
Before the official announcement of this program, we have already in place some sort of government agency in town and city in the UK. And then after 2 or 3 years, and we became finally introduced in the UK.
So in the process of territorialization, was the policy changed or not? And I think this is one of the crucial sections of the paper, actually, on page 180, the left column. There it says, unsurprisingly, the English BID program was quite unique. And in particular, it differs in 3 quite fundamental ways in design from the US-derived model. So what Wardham can show is that while this program was territorializing, it was actually adjusted so that it could fit in the in the UK setting. So what are the differences? How was the UK model different from the US model? So here they mentioned 3 arguments, right? First thing they say was different is that in the UK, the Business Improvement District program was introduced by the state. So in Toronto and in the US, this program was pushed by companies. They wanted to control. Actually, in the UK, the state wanted not to have the responsibility. They wanted the companies to take responsibility. And of course, they also wanted the companies to pay for it, right? So they actually wanted companies to do that. That's the first difference. The second difference is that the decision making in these districts was different. In the US, property owners vote, but in the UK, that's owners. So only if you're owner of property. In the UK, anybody that pays rent vote. That's including everybody that lives in that area, basically, right? Now, this is extremely fundamental because it means that businesses cannot control the decision making. Now, why is it crucial? In the UK democracy, given how the culture is in decision making, it would be impossible for the state to give away the management of space to a company. And all the citizens in the UK would go crazy if you do that, right? So, but in the US, in these business districts, there are hardly any people living anyway. It's just all businesses. And in the US, people find it pretty acceptable that businesses can decide on what happens in their areas. So there's very different opinions in the UK and in the US for thinking about decision making and the relationship between state and society, and especially the role of corporations. So in the end, because of these differences, so if they would have pushed to introduce the BAD program as it was in Toronto, that was just not possible. Then everybody would have gone crazy in the UK. So this is a very clear example of how the BAD program is changed while it's territorialized. Which could also mean then that it's not so successful because it becomes a different program in a way, right? So maybe in the UK in the US, it was really successful because the companies could decide. And then in the UK, the companies couldn't decide anyway, so it didn't work so well. So this is really the basic argument of this paper. That on the one hand, policies change and policies are moving from one place to the other, but you will always have to look at how they land and what are the characteristics of the place where they land to see if that can work or not. So very similar to the example that I mentioned about face mask wearing. So in the end, that in the Netherlands, for instance, there was not a rule that you have to wear a face, that you're obliged to wear a face mask. Then they said, well, you only have to wear a face mask in public transportation, right? And next, in the Netherlands, they also introduced that if you've got medical reasons which make wearing a face mask difficult, you can get an exemption. About 10% of all people in the Netherlands receive exemptions. So basically 10% of people are saying they have medical difficulties to wear a face mask, which seems a little bit outrageous to me because that just can't be right. If in other places everybody's wearing these masks, I know that some people with asthma, for instance, might find it difficult, especially if it's hot, but that cannot be 10%. So these are examples of how a policy is totally changed when you implement it somewhere else, which then also, of course, influences the efficiency of this program. So that's the main argument of this paper. So the sort of question in a test that you would get is, you need to be able to explain what is a territorial and a relational perspective. You need to be able to apply that to policy transfer, and you need to explain what that means for successful policy transfer. When it means, well, you need to learn from somewhere, but you also need to think about how it's being changed when you implement it in a location. So this is what I wrote down as the conclusion of McKenna Ward. Policy transfer is as much about the mobility of policies as about the reception of these policies in territories. Transfer agents play a crucial role in the transfer of policies. These agents claim that certain best practices should be copied, and they very often have an interest to do that. And in the process of this transfer, these practices get transformed due to territorialization. It's a good color. I really like how all your faces change color when the color of the... Oh, this is really, look at this. It's really cool actually. Okay, so I was originally planning that we would have the break here, so that didn't happen. So I'm going to continue, but that was the slide to do the break. Because we need to talk about the third text by Ai Ong, and that's the difficult one, right? So the topic that Ai Ong talks about is the multiple sources and effects of best practices. So I will tell you first what the core ideas of Ai Ong's text. So we started with talking about developmentalism, right? And the idea that there's one single direction of development and that everything goes through the same steps. Ai Ong represents a way of thinking that says, no, developments can come from very many places and influences come from very many places. And things, if you think about transfer, about mobility, things from really many places go to somewhere. So there is not one trajectory, there are many different types of trajectories. So think, for instance, about, if you think historically about cultural things like Buddhism, which started in India, but then moved to all sorts of different directions. And in the process, it changed. So Buddhism in Japan eventually is very different from Buddhism in China, and it's very different from Buddhism that went south to. So it's about those differences. So I will stresses there's not one best way to do things and everything becomes the same. It's much more about things from everywhere move to everywhere, and especially as the core of her paper is that increasingly nowadays things are not moving from the West to the rest of the world, but increasingly things, for instance, are from within Asia to another Asian place. So if you now think about where in Asia are governments learning from, probably a lot of Asian governments are learning from Singapore because it functions pretty well. It's perceived as a place that functions well. It's got a good GDP, it looks good, right? So it seems a nice place. Learning from Shanghai is also one of these places. Hong Kong used to be one of those places, and I think nowadays it's not perceived maybe as such, but maybe in a little while it will be again, we don't know, right? In Southeast Asia, Bangkok is also perceived partly as a place that you could learn from. So it can be many different places depending. So if you're the mayor of Vientiane in Laos wants to learn from Bangkok, right? Because Bangkok is ahead. So there's a lot of these different ways of which you can learn. And very importantly, that's one of the arguments also of Ai Ong, it's smart to learn from places that are relatively similar to where you're from. This is something we've mentioned before already. So, of course, you could, so for instance, if a Dutch country or the mayor of Amsterdam wants to learn about mask wearing, yeah, of course they could look in Asian cities, but the cultures are so different that maybe it's much smarter to go look in a couple of European cities to see how that works. This is the argument of Ai Ong. There's not one direction, but you can learn from many places, and you have to pick the place that's relatively similar to where you're from if you really want to learn successfully. So that's, I think that's one of the cores of what she says, right? Now this is, we've also already noticed, this is a complex paper, right? Who is Ai Ong? Sorry? No, she's not Chinese. But, well, she's got Chinese ancestry, but she's from Malaysia. But, yeah. What else? What? Sorry.
She's the professor in Berkeley. socialist and affected by the Marxism.
Yeah. So she's a professor. For a long time, she was a professor in the University of, in South California, and her background is anthropology. And what is interesting about her, on the one hand, I think she would say she's a Marxist, but at the same time, she has been doing a lot of work on post-colonial theory, on theories that focus on the dominance of Western theories in the world, and that want to show how that's not good. It's about theories that want to understand places from how they are themselves, apart from Western theories, right? Now, she's written this as an introduction in a book, and the book she wrote together with a professor from India, right? But she wrote this paper on her own, and it's called Worlding Cities, on the Art of Being Global. Why is it called Worlding Cities? What is worlding?
Different from the global city.
It's what?
I mean, different from.
It's different from the global city, yes. So how is it different? And how is it related? Because you mentioned it also. So in a way it relates to the global city, but it's also different. How can we understand that?
The cities mainly distributed in the Asia, and they didn't use the model as a Western development model.
Yeah.
And they also didn't present themselves as capitalism, and they mainly work for their own country.
Yeah, so this is all true, but how then is worlding different from global? How is the worlding and globalization? Because she describes globalization and worlding together, but she prefers worlding over globalization. What's wrong with globalization according to Iwa Ong? So there's two things that I will think are wrong with globalization. First of all, globalization stems from this whole developmental perspective, as if it's something that comes from the West and goes to the rest of the world. And secondly, globalization is very close to putting the economy first. It's a very economic way of thinking. So what she proposes is worlding is also about the movement from things to other places, and the fact that things become increasingly connected. But she stresses that it's not coming from a center to the outside, but it's going from everywhere to everywhere. And she also says that's not only economic, it's also cultural. She's got a much wider view. And she actually criticizes approaches that reduce this increasing connectivity of the world to economic reasoning. Right? So that if you look at the paper, the steps that she takes, she starts with an introduction. The introduction is just about the fact that there is travel and the world is connected and you see similar things in similar places. That's just an introduction. Then she gets to the section singular logics. Singular logics in urban change. What does she mean with singular logics in urban space?
issues and all the post-colonial like to carry out their research on the cities.
Yeah.
They disagree with these two approach, and she mentioned that that research should be more sensitive to the local, to the cities' efforts and the spiritual change.
Yeah.
Spiritual change.
So what she means with singular logic is typically also what developmentalism is. It's an approach that wants to explain the development of a city through one process only. And she mentions two theories that do that. It's either the Marxist theory, the critical Marxist theory, or the post-colonial theory. And they act like the development of cities can be understood through one singular logic. So the Marxist theory, for instance, criticizes globalization as a process of capital, where capital just creates global cities, and it happens the same everywhere. And that Marxist approach just acts like that is the necessary way of things to go. And that's the criticism that the Marxist theory has. Iwo Ong says that if you look like that, you totally miss how each of the cities where globalization takes place are also very different. And to say it in the words of Ward and McCann, the Marxist theory doesn't see the territorialization of globalization. It doesn't see that in each of these cities they still have their own characteristics. So Iwo Ong suggests instead of thinking of one process that takes place the same everywhere, you should look at a lot of different processes that come together in a location and then get mixed into a specific setting locally. So think about a Chinese city. When there's a new government policy, national government policy, all the cities will change because of their policy, right? But then they will still change differently because they have their own characteristics, and the way that this policy will influence those cities will be different. That's the same way that globalization works. When globalization is financial capital, for instance, coming to a city. Well, what happens with that financial capital is still very different depending on how that city is. So Iwo Ong stresses that it's important to keep looking in a territorial way at urban transformations. So what else? What next? And then she criticizes two approaches. She's quite detailed about both the Marxist approach and the post-colonial approach and why they're wrong. And next, instead of looking at it in that way, she starts talking about worlding practices. So that's where the word worlding comes. And she says, instead of globalization, which is this one-directional process where everything changes the same, which is very economic, we should look at worlding of processes things that come from elsewhere land in cities, and how these cities are then what she called worlded. They embed things from elsewhere in their cities, but the way that this happens is still also very typical for that city itself. And then she discusses three types of practices. What are the three types of practices that she discusses? One is modeling. Interreferencing. The third one. Yeah, new solidarity. So what is modeling?
Singapore is good, and other cities learn from Singapore.
Yeah. So it has to do with something like a model, and also, but what you're saying now is also partly interreferencing, because it's referencing another place, like Singapore, and we want to be like Singapore, right? So the model is then the Singapore model, a way of doing things in Singapore, right? And a model can also be a physical structure. So think about, if you think about urban development of mainland China under communism, Russia ideas about urban development have been really important. So in Russia, there was this idea of what is called the micro-rayon. It's the idea of a micro-scale area, and that where there was business also, it was based on factories. That idea of the micro-rayon is a model. And actually that model in the 1950s was introduced into China. And if you want to look at a lot of the early state-owned enterprises and what they look like, they're quite similar to how the micro-rayon look in Russia. Why is it? Because in the 1950s, a lot of engineers from Russia were working and advising China. There were a lot of links between Russia and China at the time, right? So that's an example of a model. Another example of a model would be the Podium Building in Hong Kong. What is a Podium Building? Do you know? So this is this typical building form. If you go in Hong Kong, you see very often, if you're standing in the street, for the first 15 meter or 20 meter, you see this wall. And above it, you see all these towers. Right? You must have seen that. So if you walk around in Hong Kong, this is typically how Hong Kong is being developed. The first 15 to 20 meters, it's actually 70 meters by law. That's where the car park is and where a lot of the installations are, right? And then on top of that, and that is totally 100% built area. According to the law, up till 70 meters in Hong Kong, you're allowed to build 100%. So the whole plot, so if you buy this plot here, you can buy to 70 meters just the whole plot. So you will build that all. And then on top of that 70 meters, you're only allowed to build 70%. So what do you get? You get these towers that are standing on top of that podium. And then on the 70 meter, that becomes a collective space. That's where the grannies will walk around and where the children will play. That's the public space in the building, right? That's called a podium building. And the podium is the top of these 70 meters, on which then all the collective services are, right? That's also where very often then the swimming pool will be, if it's a little bit more expensive building. Now this podium building was invented in Hong Kong. If you go to Guangzhou, you'll see a lot of podium buildings. And actually in China, in certain places you see a lot. Why? Because in the early urban development, a lot of developers that started to build real estate in China were actually Hong Kong developers. So they used the model of the podium buildings and brought it to China. And then, of course, Chinese developers started to learn from them and adapted it and changed it. So modeling is and these are very physical examples of models. But modeling is taking a sort of model to do something and bring it to another place. What is interreferencing? So basically, interreferencing is that you use the reference to another place to say what you want to happen. So when you're in Hong Kong and you say you want to be like Shanghai, that says something about the sort of development that you want, right? Or it can also be negative. In Hong Kong, they can say we don't want to be like Shanghai. That can also be. But you use the example of another place to say what you want to be or not. Think about real estate projects, residential projects. They're very often there the names of maybe Spanish cities or whatever, right? Or here in Hong Kong, they're all called Houston Court and all these names that refer to England. And then, of course, the names that they refer to in England are nice places. So that's an ambition. It's using another place from elsewhere to say what you want to do. And then the new solidarities, I will only in the chapter really is very vague about what that means. But new solidarities means that in response to these changes in cities, in response to worlding, groups of citizens also start to form new solidarities of resistance. A little bit in line with the paper of Margaret Meyer that we discussed earlier. And that what I will own says also these resistances against this worlding, they learn from each other of open space. So for instance, home ownership associations in mainland China that are not happy with home ownership, They will communicate with ownership associations maybe in Hong Kong. And protesters in Egypt were communicating with protesters in Tunisia. So that's the new solidarity dimension of worlding. Now, the most crucial thing from IWOM that you need to remember is that things travel from all sorts of places to other places. It's not only from a center to a periphery, or it's not only from the west to the east, and that's a good thing actually, that it's not only from the west to the east. And secondly, that while they travel, they land in cities, and that's why she calls it worlding. They're still adjusted. So that argument is pretty similar to Ward and McKen's argument. Now, what I've done in the PowerPoint is I've collected the quotes that I think are really crucial from this text. So I'm not going to read them out all, but they're going to help you in I think really that these are the crucial text. So as you see, these are all quotes, right? So Iwa starts with criticism of the urban studies literature. She sees singular logic of global change focusing on the homogenizing effects of capitalism. I'm not going to read all these things out, but these are really going to help you when you study this text another time. I think that these really are the essential steps. So the first one is that there are singular logic. The second one is then she criticizes two of these types of singular logics. The one is capitalism, the other one is post-colonialism. Next, she argues against these singular logics, so she's got reasons why those singular logics don't work. And then she gets an argument why she doesn't talk about globalization but about worlding. And these quotes explain what is worlding. And then next she's talking about how in the process of worlding there is a relationship with things that come from elsewhere and how they land in spaces. So extrapolating from these theories, worlding refers not to a single unified political process, but to diverse spatializing practices that mix and match different components into a space. And then the last thing is then that there's three styles of worlding. So I want to stress again that I realize that this is a complex text, but why I like it a lot is because it's really very critical of these models that start thinking from the West, as if what happens in the West happens everywhere, and it's very much focused on Asia. It's written by somebody from Asia about Asia. And it's writing about how are Asian cities transforming, both economically and culturally, under influence of the fact that they're increasingly connected with each other. Now we're gonna, in the week of the literature review, the week before the test, we're gonna discuss the individual text another time. I suggest that when you prepare, have a good look at these quotes that are in the PowerPoint. Read the text another time, and then if you have questions or if it's really unclear, we can discuss it then. But in the literature review, that will really, I'll just have the printout pack of the text that you need to read, and I'll just, again, discuss them one after the other. And I'll say, for this text you need to know this, for this text you need to know this, so that it's quite focused on what you need to study. So then also, if you study before that meeting, study these quotes and see if that helps. Okay? So this is just the core conclusions of IWOM. Have a look at it. So I've got it's time, but I've got a couple of things I want to say. And that's about how should we think about homogenization? Too many syllables. How should we think about this process? Because it's partly something that we all experience, right? If you think about things are everywhere now. So how should you think about this? Well, there's two arguments here that you can use. The first one, this is a quote from another anthropologist who actually is the big inspiration for IWOM, Arjun Appadurai. He's an Indian anthropologist, and he's writing about the travel of cultural artifacts around the world. And he's saying a vast array of empirical facts could be brought to bear on the side of homogenization. So he's talking about specifically homogenization, and he's saying, well, there's good reasons to good arguments to agree with the idea of homogenization. However, what these arguments fail to consider is that at least as rapidly as forces from various metropolises are brought into new societies, they tend to become indigenized in one way or another. Now, indigenized, the word that Apodorei uses, is the same as territorialized by McKenna Ward, right? So they tend to become indigenized. There's something missing there. This is true of music and housing styles as much as it is true of science and terrors and spectacles and constitutions. So when things move from one place to another, they will be adjusted to that local setting. So for instance, there's hard rock music everywhere, or there's dance music everywhere, but there will be local styles still. So that's one argument that you can bring against the idea that every city becomes the same. So for instance, every city maybe has a metro, but the way that a metro functions is different in every city. For instance, if you go to Bangkok and you look at the metro, if you get out of the metro, there will be motorcycle taxi drivers. These motorcycle taxi drivers are crucial. The same actually is true for Guangzhou, but the amount of motorcycle taxi drivers and the distance that they want to travel is different. So if you look at the metro system, you should not only look at the physical trains that are there, but you have to look at how this system is embedded in the whole society and how it can function. And Apodorei says that if you look at that, you will see that all of these systems are different, the way they function. Now this is just one example of this. This is a picture of McDonald's in Shenzhen. This was the first McDonald's that opened up in China. And the funny thing is, in the 1990s, McDonald's so around the world, McDonald's is not really a classy restaurant, right? It's known as, it's not, if you eat McDonald's food, well, you can do that and you do it because you've been drinking maybe or whatever, but it's not healthy food or anything, right? If you would look in McDonald's in the 1990s, this was a business meeting place. A lot of businessmen who came mainly from Hong Kong over the border to do business and set up their businesses in the special economic zone would go there. So the funny thing is, if you would look at how this functioned as a restaurant, what sort of place it was, what sort of culture was inside, what sort of people were there, it was totally different from a McDonald's here in Hong Kong. The Hong Kong McDonald's, again, is totally different from a McDonald's in the Netherlands. In Hong Kong, McDonald's for a long time were really the places where homeless people can actually sleep. If you look at night at Hong Kong, McDonald's is really important in Hong Kong at night. And COVID has changed that a little bit, of course, because most of them are closed now. But this was always the place where really precarious people who didn't have houses could at least sleep in a warm place. That's totally different. So actually, from that point of view, McDonald's in Hong Kong is a social workplace almost, right? Which is pretty interesting. In the Netherlands, that would be impossible, because in the Netherlands, if somebody would lay on a bench, he would be kicked out directly. So these things are, although they are all McDonald's, the way that they function is really very different in all of these places. So that's a typical argument of territorialization or indigenization, right? The second argument against homogenization is, well, homogenization still has the assumption that it goes from somewhere and then all goes through another place and then everything becomes the same. But that really overlooks the fact that things are much more messy and crisscrossing and go from everywhere to everywhere and move somewhere first and then somewhere else. So new urban practices do not only start in Western City, but they increasingly can come from anywhere and travel to anywhere. There's no one development from the developed world to the developing world, but there are a huge amount of sources from where practices travel around the world. And then also in some places, so if you for instance would look at the travel of Korean pop music, that was already really popular in Asia when it was not popular in the West at all. But then now it's also really popular in the West. So does that mean that everything becomes the same? Well, yeah, if you look at the end result, maybe everywhere people like Korean pop, but then by the time that in Europe they like Korean pop, probably here there's already something else hip. So things are much more changing all the time. Fashion is the typical example where Japanese fashion has been, that was really in the 1980s how Japanese fashion was influencing the catwalks in Europe. That was something really new. And if you now look at fashion styles come from everywhere almost. And it can really be, it's very code from everywhere. Does that mean that everything becomes the same? Well, in a way, it can come from everywhere, but then every place also has its own styles and its own typical things, right? So that's about homogenization. So these are the conclusions for today, because it's time. Neoliberalism has conquered the world through policy transfer. So this is also the means of neoliberalism. Best practice is always successful in a specific place. And next week we will talk about the characteristics of that place, and we will especially talk about regimes as a way to talk about that place where best practices need to land. The source of policy transfer is not only the West. Look at best practices in many places, and especially it's very important to look at transfer agents. So if you want to understand the success of Korean boy bands or Korean music, you really have to look at the managers of those bands and the labels and how they have and the television companies. And how they have links in Asia, for instance, with television companies in other countries. That's really, these are the agents that make it travel. Now, and the importance for transfer agents, this is already looking forward to the tutorial projects. In your tutorial projects, you will be in groups. And basically, you have to research best practices in different cities as a group, and then do an advice of which policy should be brought to the client city. So you're basically operating as a transfer agent in that case, right? And then next week we first are going to talk, as I said already, about how things land in a place by talking about regimes. And this is the literature for next week, but you can find it in the course outline also. Okay, that was my discussion for today. Are there any questions? If not, then it's late and it's evening and it's Friday, so let's go home. Or do more studies, that's also okay. Okay guys.
Do more own stuff. Library.
Go to the library.
Go to library, yeah.